Let's now take a look at some important points of comparison in the other suites. We will begin with some details in Suite 1. Measures 1 to 6 in the prelude demonstrate the inconsistent slur length. What one does see is a slur on every first and third beat, although not on the third beat in measure 5, where the pattern changes. Most cellists use either a 3-note or a 4-note slur on the first and third beats. Let's take a close look at 3 measures in the prelude. The indicated slur agrees in sources A, B, C, and D, although source C is debatable. Source E has 4 notes slurred. On beat 2, a slur appears only in source A, going into the fermata. The tie from the fermata is missing in source B. The slurs on beats 3 and 4 are only in source B, continuing in the following bar. The slurs in the next measure are in all sources except source A. There are many mistakes that have been duplicated and handed down through published editions and performances. One of the most prominent is in the prelude of Suite 1 at measure 26. It is important to remember that chromatic signs were generally reiterated throughout a measure during the Baroque period, although such accidentals were marked inconsistently. This practice became less common during the time of sources C, D, and E. Chromatic signs are not reiterated if it is quite obvious they are implied. In this passage we are looking at, note the B flat on the 4th beat and the C sharp at the end of the next measure in sources A and B. On the 3rd beat 2nd note, there is a flat sign on the B only in source E. All earlier sources A, B, C, and D have no accidental marked until the 4th note. So it is in the first edition from 1824, more than a century after the suites were written, that an editor decided there should be a flat, creating an augmented second from the C sharp. The augmented second is repeated in sources C, D, and E in an editorial rewrite of the end of the following measure. This is something an intermediate copyist must have altered, and it was then passed along to the later copies. This demonstrates that when there is agreement between sources A and B, one can conclude that they are very likely correct. Turning now to the allemande, the indicated trills appear only in sources C and D. The next trill appears in sources B, C, and D, giving it more validity. Sources C, D, and E have an added appoggiatura, making it clear that the trill starts on the upper note as usual in Baroque style. The 3rd trill is again in only sources C, D, and E, likely added by an intermediate copyist. In measure 29 of the allemande, the sources have a difference of pitch. Again, sources A and B agree. We can conclude that sources C, D, and E have an error in common. In the sarabande, appoggiaturas are found in sources C, D, and E. This chord is only found in sources C, D, and E. The stem direction for the F-sharp trill is also reversed in sources A and B. In source A, we see what is likely a wrong note just before the F-sharp. While the slurs in measures 2 and 3 are in agreement, the first beat of measure 4 is slurred only in sources A and B. And the final beat of the bar is slurred in sources B, C, and E. In this line, slurs consistently agree. Measure 13, however, has a notable disagreement over pitches. The key signature is 1 sharp, but source A is missing the natural sign in beat 1, found in all other sources. This was probably an error of omission, but did not get transmitted to later sources C, D, and E. Beat 2 has F sharp in all sources, although source A is F sharp from the key signature, and source B is an assumed F sharp due to the key signature and the practice of chromatic signs needing to be reiterated within a measure. Beat 3 has a G sharp marked in only sources C, D, and E, anticipating the bass note G sharp on the next downbeat. The agreement of sources A and B makes F sharp, G natural the more likely intention of Bach. Sources C, D, and E not only share the G sharp, but also have an added appoggiatura on the second beat. Suite 1 Minuet 2 is well known for the conflicting markings of pitches E natural and E flat, which are the 6th scale degree in G minor. The parallel notes of measures 3 and 7 differ in the last note of the bar and do not seem to follow the expectations of filiation. We find an E flat in sources B and D. At measure 7, the E is marked with a cautionary natural sign in sources A, C, and E. Source D has an obvious error, and source B has a flat sign as seen in measure 3. One might choose to play an E flat at measure 3 and an E natural at measure 7. Next, we will examine several spots in Suite 2. In the second statement of this sequence, source A has an incorrect note. We find the same mistake appearing in sources C and D. There are some notes we have become accustomed to hear. This sharp only appears in source B, but it is quite possibly a mistake of omission in source A that got passed along to sources C, D, and E. Unfortunately, it is only in Suite 5 that we have a lute suite with which to compare. At the fermata in the prelude, this note only appears in source B, spelling a dominant chord in root position rather than the dominant 7th chord in third inversion we are accustomed to hear. Yet there are some things appearing only in source B that we universally accept, such as in the Suite 2 Allemande, the upper note A creating a tritone. Another marking unique to source B is the lower note F indicated here in the courant. These are quite possibly changes and additions that Bach made in his clean copy Alpha. Likewise, it may have been added by Kilner or by his exemplar Gamma. It is also possible that it was omitted in source A and then by filiation omitted in sources C, D, and E. This note got altered in the first edition. This chord in the saraband is possibly a later addition by Bach as it appears in source B. An intermediate copyist in the filiation from source A must have added the C found in sources C, D, and E. The rhythm on beat 3 agrees in sources B, C, D, and E. The trill on beat 4 agrees in sources A, C, D, and E. It appears that both A and B left something out. This is a rewrite found only in source B. It uses the eighth note pattern from measure 2 and adds a trill to the dominant chord. In the jig of Suite 2, there is a repeating pattern in measures 25 through 28 with a rising bass line. The last two notes of measure 28, going stepwise up to F, are found in all sources except source A. What we see in source A is a repetition of the 16th notes in the previous 3 bars. When there is a mistake in which something is repeated in the wrong spot, either from the previous or the following measure, it is called a mistake of perseveration. These appoggiaturas appear only in source B. Thus again we must consider where they originate from, perhaps added by the copyist Kilner, or by Kilner's exemplar Gamma, or by Bach himself in his clean copy Alpha. It seems less likely that these were omitted by Anna Magdalena Bach in source A, and the omission transmitted to sources C, D, and E. Let's begin Suite 3 with the opening of the prelude. We find general agreement on slurs. In the A minor section, slurs are similar in all sources, crossing from the 4th 16th note to the 1st 16th note, but differing in length. The following passage continues with slurs across the beat. However, they are indicated less and less frequently, except in source E. Slur markings in the G pedal section are uniformly 1 slur per beat, and they do not slur across the beat or across the bar line. Turning to the saraband, appoggiaturas are likely an editorial addition. In the next line of the saraband, this is a pitch difference. Sources A and D have the pitch B flat, although with no reiterated flat sign. Sources B, C, and E have the pitch C. In the first barré, the trill in measure 2 is only found in sources C, D, and E. In barré 2, the A flat in source B is just as likely to be correct based on the style of Bach's writing. This is an example of reasonable competing readings and is a possible error of omission. In the jig measure 1, the 4 16th notes are slurred in sources A and B. In sources C, D, and E, these notes are slurred 2 and 2. In measure 19, the 6 16th notes in source A differ from all other sources and lack the rhythm of an 8th note followed by 4 16th notes. The use of the same rhythm as previously in the sequence also seems relevant, even though the stepwise notes go downward instead of up. 3 measures later, source B has a pitch error. This is more obviously a mistake when compared with the following 4 bars shown in line 2 and the parallel passage in the second half of the jig shown on line 3. The last note in this line can be identified as a mistake in sources A, C, and D. Sources B and E have the correct pitch, one that appears in most editions and performances. It appears that a correction was made in source A. The first point in Suite 4 is a matter of pitch. In the prelude of Suite 4, measure 16, we find another example of perseveration. First, notice that in the following measure, bar 17, the second eighth note is a D flat in all sources. Anna Magdalena Bach mistakenly copied the D flat chromatic sign into the previous measure. This was then transmitted to sources C, D, and E. Again, we see that these four sources share a likely error. The editor of source E added a flat sign to the lower D on the sixth note of the measure. Obviously, a D natural would clash badly with a D flat on the second eighth note of the bar. Sources A, B, C, and D do not have a flat on the sixth eighth note, which is the biggest clue that the upper D should also be a D natural. The harmonic progression in measures 14 to 19 is therefore a dominant seventh circle of fifths moving from B flat major to A flat major. This creates a parallel between the B flat phrase at measure 15 to 16 and the A flat phrase at measures 19 to 20, as in both cases only the bass note changes, moving downward stepwise. Likewise, in both four-measure phrases, the top note moves every 2 measures. Jumping to measure 59 in the prelude, this four-note chord has the pitch A on the third string in sources B and E. Sources A, C, and D have the pitch C. Source B has incorrect pitches for the two preceding notes and then struggled to write the 16th notes following the chord. The downbeat chord in the following measure is obviously correct in sources B and E. Sources A, C, and D have the pitch D, leaving out the third of the chord and not a suitable technical choice for cello. The prelude of Suite 4 at measure 80 is an example of another error introduced in the first edition. The pitch B flat is used throughout the third and fourth beats in sources A, B, C, and D. B flat is in the key signature, but was probably marked as a cautionary accidental due to the use of C flat. Source E marked a B double flat, and many editions and performances have this error. The Allemande of Suite 4 has an unfortunate error in source E, which has persisted in many editions. Not only is A flat in the key signature, but a cautionary accidental is written in sources A, C, and D. In the following measure, source E again notates an A natural. All sources have an A natural on the third note of the third beat. Trills in the Suite 4 courant are often marked sporadically, appearing in some sources and not others. Such ornaments can often be compared with parallel passages. This first trill in the movement is missing from source A, which also has an incorrect triplet marking in that measure. In the following two lines, source B has two unique trills. These trills are parallel with the passage at the beginning of the second half, which has trills in all sources. This is another trill in the first half of the courant. It is marked in sources B, C, and D. The trill in the parallel passage at the end of the movement appears in sources A, B, C, and D. A trill in measure 59, found in sources B, C, and D, does not appear in the parallel spot at measure 21 in any source. The cadential trill at the end of the first half of the courant is only found in source B. The situation is duplicated at the end of the second half. The only issue of pitch in the courant is a missing flat sign in source A at measure 34. D flat is marked in all other sources. In the saraband, appoggiaturas appear in sources C, D, and E. Trills are marked in measure 1 in source C, measure 3 in sources B and C. Both measures have a turn in source D. Similar markings are found in the first measure of the second half. We will begin in Suite 6 by examining slurs in the first 3 bars of the prelude. In measures 1 and 2, slurs are 2 plus 1. Measure 3 onward is slurred by the beat, with occasional lapses in one copyist or another. Dynamics are marked in sources A, C, D, and E. Perhaps they were not in Kellner's exemplar. Line 2 continues slurs by the beat. Dynamics appear in all sources except B. One can see that in Suite 6, Bach used alto clef for higher passages, such as in measure 90. Source E uses treble clef read down an octave. Most modern editions use tenor clef. Measure 91 in the prelude has a pitch many cellists are not accustomed to hear. The final note of the measure is the pitch G in sources A, C, and D. Only the first edition has the pitch A. The G is the seventh of the dominant harmony, thus leading to the resolution on D in the following bar. Source B has an ambiguous marking that was probably a correction from pitch A to G. Another pitch is of interest at measure 95. The second to last note of the measure is the pitch C sharp in sources A, C, D, and E. Source B has the pitch A, which is very convincing. It follows the sequence from the previous measure with a descending line in the last beat. This is likely another error of perseveration, as the Anna Magdalena Bach copy continues the pattern of beats 2 and 3 with the C sharp, and this was then passed along, as we have seen in many other cases, to sources C, D, and E. In the first measure of the allemande, the trill on beat 3 is only in source B. This is probably not legitimate, as it would be quite challenging to perform. On the fourth beat, a trill appears only in sources C, D, and E. The rhythm on the second half of beat 4 appears to be 4 64th notes, 1 32nd note, and 2 64th notes. There is a missing beam in source B for the last 2 notes, while source D has an additional beam on those 2 notes with the trilled note dotted. Source A appears to have signs of the 64th note beam being erased, conforming then with the rhythm in sources C and E. In the allemande measure 2, the lower note B of the double stop on beat 2 is missing in source A, although the notes are stemmed upward. There are small differences between the other sources, with source B using an eighth note and displacing it to the left, and source E placing the pitch B a 16th note early and leaving out the tie to beat 2. Likewise, the chord on beat 3 is missing in source A. And a trill is on beat 4 in sources B, C, and D. The primary question in the courant revolves around slurs on the rhythmic figure with 2 16th notes. When slurs are notated, they most often appear to include the following eighth note and sometimes 2 eighth notes. This chart shows how many notes appear to be slurred in each measure with the 2 16th note figure. Blanks indicate no slur in that measure and source. Source A has many measures with no slur, and when there is a slur, it varies in length. Source B has only one slur in the entire movement. In measure 14 of the courant, a mistake was made in source A, writing a low F sharp instead of E. The sources have relatively few differences in the saraband until the second to last measure, the bass note on beat 1. Source A has the pitch G, source B has the pitch G sharp, source C has the pitch A, source D has both pitches F and A, and source E has the pitch G agreeing with source A. We next examine a missing pitch in the first gavotte, measure 7. Source A is missing the indicated pitch D. A reminder that sources A, B, C, and D are in alto clef. Source E is in treble clef, read down an octave. Looking closely at source A, the sharp sign on the E is another obvious error. In the second gavotte, the section with the D string drone, the indicated note remains on the pitch D only in source A. All other sources have the pitch B on the second beat. The jig has a pitch difference in source B that is again an example of reasonable competing readings. 2 dissonant chords were altered in source E, but all other sources agree. This 16th note version in measure 18 appears only in source B. It imitates the rhythm and pitches in measure 2, and it therefore seems plausible that it could have originated in Bach's alpha copy. At the double bar, all sources have a dotted quarter note on beat 1. All sources also have eighth notes with staccato dots on beat 2. The E, F sharp, G figure in this measure is written in source A as a pair of 16th notes. Source B puts the rhythmic figure on the second beat, while sources C and D write the E, F sharp as grace notes, perhaps performed on the beat as written in source B, or performed ahead of the beat. Let's take another look at the timeline. Lost intermediate copies led to sources C, D, and E, which show strong filiation from source A. The Kilner copy and Bach's lute suite show strong signs of filiation in common. It is clear that sources A and B are unrelated in filiation. It is unlikely that Kilner copied directly from a Bach autograph manuscript. This implies an intermediate copy that was his exemplar, and which was copied from a Bach manuscript used for the lute transcription.